So I'm taking a little break from my usual Dragon Age content to talk about a game I'm really looking forward to this year, Cyberpunk 2077. Cyberpunk 2077 takes place in the universe first created for the near-future tabletop role-playing game Cyberpunk 2020, which took place in the no longer so futuristic year of 2020. While technically Cyberpunk was originally published in 1988 and took place in 2013, but the setting was really fleshed out in the second edition, Cyberpunk 2020, in 1990. From that time period, the Cyberpunk universe sort of runs a parallel track to our own, and it has developed a pretty detailed history. In my next two videos, I'm going to walk through that alternate history through 2020, and everything we know about what happens between then and the newest edition, Cyberpunk Red, which takes place in 2045. In this video in particular, though, we'll be focusing on the 3 decades between 1990 and 2020. My forewarning to you is that, like most dystopian settings, a lot of bad things happen to leave the world in its current state. All my information for this video came from reviewing the sourcebooks for the game and online research. Here we go. As the primary setting for the game, the US has the most information about it, though the rest of the world was fleshed out a bit in supplementary sourcebooks. By the late 80s, American policy was being controlled by a deep state cabal run by wealthy industrialists and the intelligence community, collectively known as the Gang of Four, who effectively ran the country behind the backs of the President and Congress. The Cold War was won, as in our timeline, but the conflict quickly ensued. In 1990, the United States began what became known as the First Central American War, with the U.S. military engaging in interventionist actions in Panama, Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador. The ultimate goal was to ensure U.S. control over the Panama Canal. In 1992, the European Economic Community was established and allowed non-European countries to enter, including Japan, which was then threatening to surpass the U.S. as the world's wealthiest nation. The U.S. declined to join, however, and a mixture of protective European tariffs and unfair trade policies had a highly damaging effect on the U.S. economy. The EEC also engaged in relations with the reformed Soviet Union and sent aid funding, which ran up against the Americans' continuance of Cold War-era policy despite the Soviets' loss of power. The Americans began a, quote, quiet war against the EEC that ultimately led to the collapse of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization established after the Second World War. The newly created European currency unit, usually called the Eurodollar for short, would become one of the world's most commonly used currencies. In the same year, the DEA, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, tried to end the war on drugs by releasing engineered plagues targeting opium and coca plants worldwide. This directly resulted in the economic and governmental collapse of Chile and Ecuador. A brutal drug war broke out between dealers backed by European corporations and the DEA across the Americas. Anti-war rioting occurs in all major U.S. cities. 1992 is also the year businessman Richard Knight began to put into practice his dream of building a utopia. With backing from several megacorporations interested in situating themselves in a crime-free, stable city, notably Arasaka, a Japanese security megacorporation, Petrochem, an American petrochemical company, and EBM, a European computer manufacturer. Richard Knight bought up land around Del Coronado Bay in California and began construction of Coronado City. The location roughly corresponds to Morro Bay in real-life geography. In the meantime, the drug war escalated and culminated in the detonation of a tactical nuclear device in New York City by Colombian drug lords in 1993. Some 15,000 people were killed, but worse was yet to come. The world stock market crash of '94 plunged the United States and the rest of the world into a cataclysmic economic depression, tipping off a series of events collectively known as the collapse. Within 2 years, the U.S. was overwhelmed with corruption, unemployment, and homelessness. Some city governments declared bankruptcy or collapsed, and the whole country is really in chaos at this point. 1 in 4 people are homeless, and hundreds of thousands riot against the government. Hundreds of criminal defense attorneys are lynched, and the military was deployed to the streets to keep order. Many small towns in the Midwest are straight up abandoned as local banks and businesses collapse. The same year, a nuclear meltdown in Pittsburgh kills 254 people, and the area is known as the Pit from that point on. This is when nomads start appearing in the U.S., fleets of vagrants roaming the lawless highways in search of work, whether that means working short-term construction, picking the harvest before moving on, or hiring themselves out as muscle. They're well and capable of defending themselves, as most nomad vehicles are bristling with stolen weaponry like something out of Mad Max. The many dangers of urban life led to the emergence of booster gangs, or boosters. These are basically just street gangs with a bunch of different flavors, really, but Cyberpunk has its own word for them. You got cult gangs, family gangs, poser gangs, self-defense gangs, all sorts. Getting back to the timeline, the NSA, under the orders of the Gang of Four, assassinated the President and Vice President of the United States in 1996. The Speaker of the House was having bypass surgery, and the pro tempore of the Senate refused the position of President, so the Secretary of State stepped up and declared martial law, suspending the Constitution and basically setting up an interim military government. The new government would spend the following years fighting covertly against the Gang of Four and the agencies that had acted with impunity for years. Also, U.S. entanglement in the Middle East never happens in this timeline, because in 1997 the Mideast Meltdown occurs. Basically, a war in the region escalated to a nuclear exchange. Iran, Iraq, Chad, Libya, and the Arab Emirates were reduced to fields of irradiated glass. Only Israel, Egypt, and Syria survived relatively intact. A sizable amount of U.S. military assets are lost in the process due to bad intelligence. Half the world's oil supply going up in smoke didn't help the world economy either. The U.S. also withdrew troops from Japan and Korea around this time. In 1998, a neo-Luddite movement starts bombing airports, freeways, and most means of transit you can think of. A massive drought decimates farmland in the Midwest and endangers the U.S. food supply, so now we have famine on the top of everything. And then we have a 10.5 earthquake hitting Los Angeles, killing 65,000 people and causing the ocean to flood 35% of the city. 1998 is also the year that Richard Knight, founder of Coronado City, died. Knight had stubbornly refused attempts by mob-owned construction companies to muscle in on his utopian project, and they responded by murdering him. The Coronado City Council renamed the city Night City in his memory. The following 7 years would be racked by conflict as corporate and mob-sponsored gangs wrestled for control of the city. The city police are wholly ineffective. Martial law officially ends in 1999, but the military stayed in power. 1999 is also when Texas declared itself the first autonomous free state in response to the federal government attempting to control guns, renaming itself the Republic of Texas. They remain part of the Union, but claim the right to ignore or revise federal laws within their borders. More states would follow in the coming years, including Alaska, California, and Utah. By the start of the next millennium, the United States' global influence was dramatically reduced. A crippled economy and significant loss from misguided ventures led to a dramatic reduction of its military capacity, and the government had effectively lost control of much of the interior. Federal elections have been suspended, while a shadow war goes on between the military and the Gang of Four. Now, with all that established, I'll briefly address some other parts of the world. One of the bigger changes in this timeline for Europe is that the Soviet Union didn't dissolve. Instead, it's reformed into a free trade zone for the Soviet republics, though it still loses its superpower status. In the late 1990s, a group of KGB and communist loyalists launched a failed coup that severely depleted the manpower and hardware of the military. One of the results being that the Soviet State Oil Company is allowed to create and arm its own security force. That will be important later. There's less specific information about the rest of Europe than the US, but in general they've managed to keep a more stable economy through the European Economic Community. Germany reunited in this timeline as well. The European Union as we know it never forms, but instead the European Community, or EC, is formed in 1997, which allows quite a lot of cooperation on large projects, in particular the Eurospace Agency. The exceptions being Italy, Spain, and Greece, which have remained outside the community and suffered a series of political upheavals. The Soviet state strengthened its ties to Europe in this timeline, becoming their strongest allies with the deterioration of ties to the US. The United Kingdom is a part of the European community, but easily the worse off. It is the only part of Europe almost as bad as the United States, gradually devolving into anarchy and economic devastation over the following decades as a result of an antiquated technological base and being swamped by massive immigration. Not much to say about Africa here because there is even less detail, except that South Africa basically collapses. Africa's economy starts to stabilize after a deal struck between Tanzania and the Eurospace Agency to put a mass driver on Mount Kilimanjaro in 1995. Bargaining with manpower, natural resources, and access to valuable equatorial land, African states become a critical part of the space age, ultimately leading to the foundation of the Tycho lunar colony in 1999. Over time, a full third of all workers in space would be African. Another big difference in this timeline is the role of China and Japan. Japan kept its rise to economic prominence and has become the U.S. closest trading partner. The pacifist clause of its constitution abolished, Japan has also become a major military power, filling the void left by the withdrawal of American forces in war. The security megacorporation Arasaka comes to dominate much of Japan, and is recognized as the most powerful corporation in the world in the coming decades, with significant influence both in America and Europe. As for China, rather than rising as a superpower as it has in our timeline, the more capitalist reforms of Deng Xiaoping resulted in a fissure in Chinese society, with hardcore Maoists rebelling against the People's Republic of China in a second civil war in 1995. The government ends up simultaneously fighting the Maoists, an uprising in Tibet, and a Muslim uprising in the northwest funded by the Soviet Union. One of the results of this being that Taiwan asserts its independence internationally with the support of Japan. With both China and the US preoccupied, war reignites in Korea, resulting in a unified republic in the mid-2000s after South Korea's victory. I'll be focusing primarily on the US from here on out, as it's the primary focus of the setting. Moving into the new millennium, the year 2000 kicks off with a wasting plague in the US and Europe, firestormings devastate farmland in the American Northwest, and a chemical attack by a Millennium cult in Berlin kills over 19,000 people. In 2001, the net, this timeline's analog to the internet, had its foundations set with the construction of the worldwide satellite network. Now remember what I said about the Soviet State Oil Company getting its own security forces? Well, in 2002, that security force locked down all facilities and declared independence from the Soviet government, becoming an independent megacorporation controlling the whole of the Soviet oil supply. In the West, it's known as Sov-Oil by this point. Also, a virus wipes out crops across Canada and the Soviet Union. US crops are spared due to a biological counteragent they developed. The Soviets accuse the US of engaging in biological warfare. Famines ensue. In the next few years, the US starts another war that would last the rest of the decade by invading several Central American countries, resulting in the US getting expelled from the region except for the Panama Canal area, which they hold through sheer force. On the somewhat upside, the Gang of Four's influence finally crumbles under the reforms of the US military government. In 2004, we got an event called the First Corporate War, when EBM, Euro Business Machines, and another corporation called Orbital Air came into conflict over who would buy out a failing business called Transworld Airlines. This ultimately escalated into an exchange of cyber warfare and terrorist attacks on one another's facilities. It ended in 2006 when commandos employed by Orbital Air captured EBM's CEO. This marks a new norm for the period, as other corporations would start resorting to force against their business rivals. Anyway, the US attempts to relax military governance by appointing a new president, who was assassinated in 2005 with the clues pointing to a corporation called Mantoga Incorporated. In Operation Big Stick, the US military gave Mantoga Incorporated 4 hours to withdraw from the country, which they did not, and then proceeded to launch a simultaneous attack on every corporate facility. Within 12 hours, every Mantoga Incorporated building in the country had been leveled. The operation was declared a success when the last living administrator of the company was assassinated in Germany the following year. The whole incident is used by the US government as a warning to the corporations not to overstep. Back in Night City, in 2005, the mob emerged on top of the local power struggles, and the city became an anarchic hellscape. The following 4 years sees Night City's ineffective civic government decay, and the city experiences more murders than most cities do in 10. The mob rules the city with an iron fist, and being part of an autonomous region, nobody really does anything about it. We got the Second Corporate War. This time the dispute was over oil fields in the South China Sea, between the Soviet oil megacorporation Sovoil and the US-based oil company Petrochem. They had a rocky history to start with, so when one of Petrochem's oil platforms exploded, they accused Sovoil of planting an explosive device. Diplomacy broke down, and Petrochem launched an attack to plant explosives and destroy one of Sovoil's platforms in revenge. It spiraled out from there, with both companies effectively crippling each other by destroying 75% of one another's oil-producing facilities in only a few weeks. Petrochem even assassinated the Sovoil CEO and founder. Nonetheless, Sovoil ultimately got the upper hand and gained control of the South China Sea oil fields by the time the war ended in 2010. Eventually it came to light that the explosion that had kicked all this off had really been nothing more than an accident. 2008 is an eventful year. The US kicks off another war, but this one is in space. The Orbital War starts with the US attempting to seize Soviet orbital weapons platforms in an effort to re-enter the space race, but the European Space Agency intervened on the Soviets' behalf. The Americans are forced to agree to peace after several weeks of fighting, when the Tycho lunar colony uses its mass driver to drop a rock on Colorado Springs, destroying the city. But maybe things are starting to look up for the US, because this is also the year the government is reformed and elections are held for the first time in over 10 years. By 2009, the ESA and the Soviets were using their orbital dominance to launch a joint mission to Mars, which succeeded in 2011. Meanwhile, the US starts looking for new friends, having pretty thoroughly burned every possible bridge with Europe at this point. The US signs a mutual defense treaty with China. The US also finally withdrew from Central America except Panama, but in doing so they left behind over 1 million nomad contractors, only about 10% of which survived the long walk home. 2009 also sees the start of the mob wars in Night City. Between 2009 and 2011, the megacorporations decided mob control was bad business and sent in Arasaka Corporation paramilitaries to secure the city. The corporations installed puppets in the local government, and the new city council deputized corporate security forces with full authority within city limits. One of the first things they did was evict anyone that did not have the financial means to renovate their homes. Hundreds of people were displaced, and the city's affordable housing was used to house corporate troops. In 2012, the Northern Separation Treaty was signed, and the state of California was split in two. Night City became part of the Free State of Northern California. We did get a lot of technological advancement in this decade. Cyberlimbs were made possible and became common military equipment, the net, and neural links that allowed netrunners to physically interface their consciousness with computers. The next decade would see the first true artificial intelligence created in 2013. That is the same year the US and European nations signed a treaty creating NetWatch, an organization dedicated to patrolling the net for illegal activity. Looking abroad for a moment, in 2015, Japan is removed from the European Economic Community as they tried to limit the influence of international corporations in Europe, establishing its own currency, the new yen. The year 2016 gave us the third corporate war, unusual in that it was fought chiefly through cyber warfare. This one was actually between two investment firms. Financial counseling firm Merrill, Asukaga, and Finch was being investigated for running a confidence scheme using another firm, the Rothstein Fund, as leverage. Not wanting to get caught up in the investigation, the Rothstein Fund turned over everything they had to the LA District Attorney. MANF reacted by sending their netrunners to attack their former allies' computer systems. Rothstein responded in kind. Eventually, both decided to attack more directly and hired mercenaries to try and destroy one another's equipment and systems, resulting in 12 hours of destructive firefights that caused millions in infrastructure damage. This followed by months of indecisive cyber attacks against one another. Eventually, the Rothstein Fund was dissolved, and MANF turned the corpses of two executives that had been responsible for the confidence scheme over to the district attorney. As for Night City, by 2020 the mob wars was a distant memory, and the corporations have made it a relatively peaceful place. Basic services like the police and fire department have been restored. The city was growing rapidly, and with Arasaka establishing a regional office in the area, it became known as a significant corporate center. Still, most travel advisories will recommend body armor, and weapons are quite commonplace. The average cyberpunk had to survive somewhere between the violent gangs and the oppressive heel of the corporate boot. Sorry, I have a sore throat at the time of recording this last bit. Those are pretty much the major events leading into the setting for Cyberpunk 2020. I'll admit some of the events here don't make a ton of sense to me. Like, near the beginning it says that European corporations start funding drug lords attacking the US, and nothing I found clearly explained why. Also, why Colombian drug lords would blow up New York either. But that's what the official material says happened. I'll be making another video about the timeline from Cyberpunk 2020 to Cyberpunk Red 2045 as soon as I get my hands on the new sourcebook. See you next time.